Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about full frame versus crop sensor cameras. What's the difference between the two? Which has an advantage over the other? Which one should I choose? We're going to talk about all that in 3, 2, 1. So what is sensor size? If you look at this picture, you can see this woman cleaning the inside of the camera, or actually the camera sensor. So every DSLR camera has this little inside area. This is actually the mirror, but this thing goes up, and underneath, right behind this little rectangle right here, that is a camera sensor. So you have both full frame and crop sensor. Okay, so this is where the information is recorded. When you take a picture, the light goes through the lens and inside, and it hits the camera sensor inside here. It's basically an area where information is recorded, and then it goes through this processor and it comes out in this little file, and that's your picture. Okay, so now let's look at some sensors. If we come to the next page, we see full frame versus crop sensor. They look the same, but they're not exactly the same. The full frame is obviously much bigger than the crop sensor. So it's actually like having a bigger pie. We could call these pies instead of sensors because everyone likes pie. So the pie right here is much bigger than this pie. So everyone wants the full frame or the big pie because you're going to get a lot more. So the camera's going to record a lot more information than over here. So obviously having more information is going to make your picture better. So let's talk more about full frame versus crop sensors. So let's say I was using a 200mm lens. If I was using a 200mm lens on a camera with a full frame, it would equal 200mm. So it's only one time. It's exactly what the lens says. And if you look at the picture, you can see that the full frame goes around the entire area, all right, that I'm taking a picture of. Now, if you look at a cropped sensor lens, it's magnified, or it's zoomed in 1.5 times. Canon lenses, it's actually 1.6, but this is a rough estimate. So for just intensive purposes of this video, in general, it's about 1.5 times. Not exactly, but it's pretty darn close. So if I use a 200mm lens on a crop sensor, that would equal 300mm because I'm cropping in 1.5 times. So as you can see, if I'm taking picture of something that was really far away, having that crop sensor would give me an advantage because I could be a lot closer to the image. However, if I wanted to get a landscape or a wide shot, with this lens it might give me a disadvantage because I can't go quite as wide. So now looking at this image on the full screen, you can see that a full frame goes 36mm by 24mm. That's the size of the actual sensor. Okay? Has nothing to do with the actual image size. The image size is going to be bigger, but we're just talking about the sensor size right now. So the sensor of a full frame camera is 36mm by 24mm. The crop sensor is going to be 22 to 24 by about 15 to 17mm. So as you can see, if you took this picture with a full frame camera, you're getting the entire area of this guy, so it's more like an environmental portrait. Whereas with the crop sensor, it's really zoomed in. I may not be able to first see that this guy is actually a surfer on top of a wave and the sun's in the background, so I'm not getting much of the sky as well or the water, so it's a much different look. Alright, let's look at another example for clarification. So if I was taking a photo with a 50mm lens, it would be quite different. So to the left, I took a picture with this on a full frame camera with a 50mm, and you can see I have the entire background. I have this entire Colombian farmer in frame, whereas on the right, he's much more zoomed in. It's much more like a headshot, so it's much more cropped in 1.5 times. I didn't really take this photo with two different cameras, a full frame sensor and a crop sensor. However, I just cropped in 1.5 times to show you the difference of how it would sort of look if I used a full frame versus a crop sensor. There are other aspects of having a full frame versus a crop sensor. Before we look at those aspects, let's look at the different sensor sizes. So here we have the vast majority of cameras on the market right now. We have everything from full frame down to the sensor on your phone. So they're all different sizes, as you can see. The sensor size goes from big to small, small to big. Okay, so on the left, the full frame is mainly the big cameras that you see. And if you notice, as you go down, the cameras get smaller. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes smaller cameras do have a cropped or even a full frame sensor. So it's not always the case with the camera size. So don't be fooled by the camera size. However, as a general rule, the bigger the camera, the bigger the sensor. Now, although we have all these camera sensor sizes, the ones we're going to concentrate are the two on the left, the full frame and the APS or the APS-C. Okay, APS-C is Canon. They're a little smaller than the Nikons and some of the others, but basically they're considered a crop sensor as well. So we're going to concentrate basically on the three, I should say, on the left, the full frame and then the two next to it that are crop sensors. Whenever you hear someone say full frame or crop sensor, you know they're referring to these two different types of cameras. Full frame is much bigger and APS or APS-C is a little smaller, all right, 1.5 times about. All right, so what are the advantages of having a full frame versus a crop sensor or one sensor over another? With a full frame, you're going to get the best image resolution and best image quality possible. You hear a lot about megapixels. I feel like this is almost like a marketing gimmick. Megapixels are important. If you have more megapixels, your image is going to look a little sharper, a little better, especially when you blow it up. However, the size of the sensor is more important, I believe, than the actual megapixels. So when you have a really big sensor, you're going to get much better resolution and you're going to get much better image quality. Another advantage of having a full frame camera is that it's great in low light. All right, when you're shooting indoors or at nighttime or there's not a lot of light around, the camera is really going to perform well. You can bump up the ISO and it's not going to be grainy or noisy. You're still going to maintain good image quality when the lighting is not that great. Now, the last advantage that I mentioned here for having a full frame camera is often underestimated by a lot of photographers. I think the shallow depth of field and having a better bokeh or background blur is much better with a full frame camera. It is noticeably different. A lot of people say that difference is negligible and that it's really just better to have a crop sensor and that having a crop sensor versus a full frame camera isn't that big of a difference. But I've noticed it's a significant difference, and if you really care about your work, I think that having a little more shallow depth of field and having that better background blur really gives your image a more painterly feel, a more artistic and creative feel. And when you blow up your image and when you print your image, you really can tell the difference. So if you're just posting your photos online, this isn't a huge advantage. But if you end up printing your images or displaying your images on a computer or someplace where it's much larger, this last advantage is really important. All right, now let's look at the crop sensor, or APS. With the crop sensor, you get the best value for your money. So it's sort of like the law of diminishing returns. If you're just starting out, you might want to get a crop sensor. I started out with a crop sensor and it still had amazing image quality. And even today, some of those images I took are as good or better than images I took with my full frame camera. So is the full frame worth $1,000 or $2,000 more than the crop sensor for having a few of those extra advantages? Well, if you're a working professional, I think it is. If you're just starting out, you might want to save that money and spend it more on camera lenses or lighting or other aspects of your photography game and some of the photography equipment that you'll need. Now, one huge advantage of having a crop sensor is that it has much more telephoto or zoom capabilities. So when you're doing sports or you're doing wildlife photography or you're doing bird photography and you need that extra zoom, having that crop sensor really helps. Of course, I always feel like you could just walk forward or try to get closer to the image. However, I understand for wildlife and certain imagery that's not always possible. So having the crop sensor can be really helpful. I think all of these advantages are clear, but the one that I think people don't really appreciate as much is the shallow depth of field and the background blur, which makes your image look really artistic and painterly. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. So right here I have two examples of photos that I took with a full frame. And as you can see on the left and on the right, there's a really pleasing background blur. Even with the image on the right where that door was right behind that farmer, there still is a background blur. There was no separation between him, and even with that little separation between the farmer and that door, you can still see a significant amount of background blur. So having that artistic approach really makes your images look a little more 3D. And it's not just about having the background blur, because the crop sensor will give you a nice background blur, but the full frame will give you a little more pleasing, a little more something. So some lenses you use might give you really sharp images. However, usually like a lens like a 1.4 lens will give you a really nice background blur. As you can see in the first image on the left, there's a really pleasing, nice, buttery smooth background blur, or bokeh. And to me, this makes the image really painterly, more artistic, and also makes the subject pop out a little more. So I think having that background blur, having that little unique look, I think helps for a photographer in the creative process. Alright guys, so if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. As we come to the next page, subscribe to this channel if you can to get more videos like this. Also press that like button. I'll be making many more videos like this in the future, so I appreciate the support. And I also made a photo gear guide. This included all my favorite photography gear, so I think this will really help you out. You can go to brettgaramella.com/guide, or just click on the link in the description to get that gear guide. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.